Hello, everybody. I'm in Incheon, South Korea, with two Australian Greens, and that's what our podcast today is going to be about. And we're going to sit down and hand the phone around. So hang in. We'll get seated and get going. So I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. And I usually open this up with a little comment. I just want to say it's good to see Trump get indicted for crimes related to the mishandling of national security documents. He's facing felonies related to false statements, obstruction of justice, illegally retaining classified documents. And for a lifelong criminal, I say it's about time. And I'm just waiting for him to be indicted for the January 6th assault on the Capitol to try to overturn a presidential election. And there were a lot of cheers around this conference when the news came out. But I'll talk more about that in the future. I'm learning a lot about Green parties around the world here, and I'll report about that in future podcasts. But today, since I've got them right here, I've got two members of the Australian Green Party. One is Tim Hollo, who, show your face.
Hey, everyone.
He's executive director of the Green Institute, which is the official, what do you call it? The think tank of the Green Party of Australia. And he'll explain how that works. He's a visiting fellow at Australian National University's School of Regulation and Global Governance. He was previously communications director for an Australian Green Senator, Christine Milne. He's been a campaigner and board member of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, articles in The Guardian and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. That's their public system. And he's got a book out called Living Democracy, an Ecological Manifesto, which we should have brought a copy of to show him. Okay, we're going to show you here in a minute. We just came out in 2021. And then our other Green is Jenny Leong. So say hi.
Hi.
And Jenny is an elected member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, which is like a state legislature in the United States. She was first elected in 2015. She's been re-elected 3 times. She's the first Australian state legislator, as far as we know, of Chinese descent. She was a human rights campaigner with Amnesty International, and as a legislator has worked on decriminalization of abortion, marriage equality, affordable housing, having the daily press conferences of the Legislative Assembly being multilingual, working on protections against sexual harassment and assault. She's the New South Wales Green spokesperson on housing, leading campaigns for renters' rights, and supported people to navigate their what they call social housing. It's like our public housing. And she is the New South Wales Greens portfolio holder for women, anti-racism, industrial relations, and human rights. And I wish we could say that about Greens in the United States and state legislators, but we're not there yet. So I pointed this out to folks here. I just want to note that Greens in Australia get about 10-12% of the vote in national elections. And their Senate, equivalent of our U.S. Senate, is elected by proportional ranked choice voting from each of the states. So they're multi-member districts. And their number of senators is reflective of their percentage of the vote, around 10%. On the other hand, they have ranked choice voting from single-member districts for their House. They have a House and a Senate like we do. And until the most recent election, out of 151 seats, they had one who won a single-member district, which shows you how important proportional ranked choice voting is for an inclusive multi-party democracy. And that's what we got to fight for in the United States. But one of the things I want to talk about today is at the national level, they went from 1 to 4 members of the House who won single-member districts, which is about like us winning a single-member district by plurality voting. It's about as tough. And then Jenny is someone who's done that at the state level, their state level. That's what you call them, states, New South Wales. Okay. So I'm going to hand the phone over to Tim and let him, explain more. He's the expert on democracy in Australia, how the electoral system works, anything I haven't said that you think Americans ought to learn, especially Greens.
Sure. Thanks so much, Howie. Yeah, look, I think Howie's explained it very well. So we have our Senate elected by proportional representation with ranked choice, what we call preferential voting. And our Senate elects 6 members from each state at each election. And there's rotating 2 terms, in fact, each election. So, yeah, with 6 members being elected for each state, the Greens in Australia are now at the stage of winning 1 senator for every state at each election. So we have 12 senators in the federal parliament. In the House of Representatives, which is we have a system where our executive government is actually formed in the House of Representatives. It's not a separate one like yours. So that's single member electorates, it's how he said, but it is preferential voting. It is ranked choice voting. So it's a little bit easier for us to win there. And it's easier for people to take the risk, I guess, of voting for us. And that's one of the really big advantages that we've got in Australia, is that voters can actually have the confidence in saying, I'm going to vote first for the Greens and then second for another party of my choice, usually the Australian Labor Party, which is our centre-left-ish, mostly pretty centrist party now. At the states, we have similar situations, but in some of them, and in some of our smaller ones, like where I come from, which is Canberra, our capital, we have a local government like, it's the equivalent of DC. The Australian Capital Territory has multiple 5-member electorates. We have five member electorates, all elected with preferential proportional voting. So in the ACT, in the Australian Capital Territory, we have 6 Greens out of 25, and we have Greens in government, 3 ministers in our Green Labor government in the ACT. That's probably enough of an introduction to how our voting works.
And we didn't get a shot of this, did we? This is Tim's book, Living Democracy, and the full subtitle is An Ecological Manifesto for the End of the World as We Know It. And that's in the positive sense of changing the world. So, Jenny, why don't you talk about, how you got elected and, the system under which you were elected and what the Australian Greens have been doing to, like, in the federal House level, go from 1 to 4 seats.
Thank you so much, Howie, and it's wonderful to be here and be part of this podcast. Always a fan of the connection between Greens and socialism, and so great to be here. I would say that one of the most key things that we've done to secure and win and then retain lower house seats has actually been our ability to connect with local communities on a real one-on-one grassroots way in terms of our campaigning. So for myself, when I was elected as a member for Newtown, it was a brand new electorate that had been established. We had already a strong Greens vote in the area, but you can imagine that the incumbent major party was not interested in letting the Greens take on the mantle of basically holding the seat. So they threw everything at it. They ran an existing MP from the upper house or the Senate equivalent in our seat to try and make sure that they tried to claim that seat off the Greens. What did we do? Well, we spent a year door knocking 1.5 times the entire electorate, going door to door, what you would call canvassing. We had street stalls, we had thousands of volunteers, and we basically ran a ground game which was talking to people about the politics, the fact that people were ignored by the 2 major parties and that we needed to see a change. As Tim has said, obviously the electoral system in Australia means that we are in a situation, because we have preferential voting, it allows people to vote 1 for the Greens and then 2 for their preferred party if the Greens aren't elected. And so that helps us convince the electorate to vote and support for us. What happened out of those tactics, where we did, was basically we identified what are the key issues in our local area that people feel widely and deeply, and that the 2 major parties, the Progressive Party or the so-called Progressive Party, the Labor Party in Australia, what are they ignoring? And we identified that we had 50% of people in that electorate that were renters. We had no party taking any commitment to be able to support renters' rights. They were interested in supporting the people that owned the investment properties and protecting their investments and their earning of money from investment properties over and above giving people security in the private rental market. So we ran hard on that. We pushed hard on those reforms. And as a result, we got a very strong primary vote. Since being elected in 2015, we've worked directly with our public housing communities. We have high density public housing of really vulnerable people in our inner cities. And my office every day deals with many, many people being screwed over by a system that is completely designed to decimate our public housing system and infrastructure in the inner city. We work directly with those communities to advocate for them, to empower them and to support their organising capacity so that they are in a position to be able to advocate for themselves. And I'm pleased to say that even under the US system at the last election, I would have won because we won on primary votes. So we got 54% of the primary vote. Those same tactics of
primary vote is the first round?
The first round, primary vote. Primary vote is the first round. So one of the things that we saw in the last federal election, the national election, Howie, that you mentioned, was an increase from 1 to 4 lower house members, what we call, so our House of Representatives. Those same tactics of doing grassroots campaigning, door knocking, talking to people about their material interests, not getting caught up in the idea of disconnecting our campaigns for climate justice with our campaigns for economic equality and economic justice were key. We ran hard on housing. We ran hard on the idea of raising the level of income support, and we spoke to people about the concerns that they had on the ground, not what people think that the Greens should talk about. And that is a real distinction, I think, of how we win and hold lower house seats, is you need to listen to the concerns of the community and reflect back the Greens' values and principles that will solve the problems they are facing day to day. It is critical that we recognise as a movement that we are not, the people that are in political parties, the people like me, like Tim, like you, Howie, we are not the people that are regular in our engagement with politics, right? Most people are not engaged with politics, they're engaged with being able to live a good life. They're engaged with the stresses and the financial pressures that capitalism, neoliberalism, and big corporations place on them. And we as Greens, if we want to represent communities locally, need to be listening to those concerns and make the connections with those people in our community for how the Greens solutions will start addressing the day-to-day challenges that people face. That's not just economic. Obviously, there are many people that care about climate and environment, but we need to recognise that they are all intersecting, and it's one of the things that, you know, we have been doing strongly locally, and I think has then played out in terms of our support and our vote.
So I hope people took home the take-home points. I think there are, you got to get out of your home, out of your office, off your computer, and go out and talk to people. Make personal connection. I don't know if you said this, but you need to keep a list of those people who are likely supporters. Have them in a database. And when the election comes, you know who you're calling on election day to get them out. Now, in Australia, they have compulsory voting. We don't. So we got to pull people to the polls. The other thing that struck me that I've experienced is you go into an election with some ideas about your issues and what you think are important. But if you go out and canvass, you will find things you didn't even think of. I found that every election, there's something on the voters' minds that just didn't get to me. But if you don't speak about that, you know, you're going to miss the boat. So, yeah, go ahead.
Just to say on that, Howie, I think that there is a false belief within campaigning that doing like calling, voter canvassing and door knocking is the way you win elections because you're talking to people one-on-one. In my view, the reason why those tactics are successful is because they actually shape your message. They shape your approach to being a candidate and your strategy of the campaign, and that's why you're successful. So to me, the door knocking and the conversations is not about trying to convince voters, but actually trying to make me a better representative that then reflects the way that I can communicate to the electorate more broadly and then gets more support because I am reflecting back the concerns of the community. But so often people see it as canvassing or door knocking and making phone calls is about telling other people what they should do, when actually the power is the other way around, right?
Yeah. I've talked about that on these podcasts. We call it deep canvassing.
Yeah.
You're not preaching to people, you're listening.
100%.
And you're finding out what's on their mind.
Yeah.
And you're building a relationship.
Yes.
So even if you disagree on the issues, you can even argue with people, but they respect the fact that you took them seriously enough to talk to them. And that's, I think, that personal connection. So people vote with their guts as much as their brains. And if they feel like you're for the people, therefore, people like them, you're likely to get their vote. Do you want to say any more about how you guys have succeeded?
Yeah, I really agree with that about, receiving messages back. I've run as a candidate a couple of times as well. Last time in our seat, we came second to the Labor Party, which is a big result. But I think the other thing I'd add is it's not only just listening and hearing and shaping the message and building that relationship, but I think one of the huge things that happened in the seats which the Greens won in the federal parliament at this last election was that they'd been doing this canvassing for a long time. They'd been building these relationships over several election cycles, and then it wasn't just shaping the message, it was shaping the behaviour. Because what happened is a couple of things happened during that election campaign process. One was, of course, COVID. People, the canvassers, the Greens in those local electorates had already built these relationships, and they were able to actually pivot into mutual aid during the pandemic and support the Greens as local campaigners and canvassers were actively not just saying to people, we can help you in your daily lives, tell us what your problems are and we can fix them. We're going to do it. And then there was a climate disaster as well. There was a massive flood in the city of Brisbane. And a whole lot of these Greens, door knockers and canvassers, went out into the streets and started doing cleanups and they were setting up sausage sizzles in the parks because a lot of people didn't have any kitchens for a long time. They were feeding people, actually doing that mutual aid, that deep relational work with people on the ground. That, I think, is what really translated into this massive swing towards the Greens.
Yeah, that's what the old Black Panther Party in the late 60s and early 70s, community services, survival, as Huey Newton said, pending revolution. And I came up in the Bay Area when they were doing that. And the thing that really struck me is there was this elementary school and kids kept getting hit by cars. They needed a stoplight and the city council wasn't responsive. So the Panther Party went out there, these guys had rifles on their back. They started directing traffic like cops. The city responded, they got a traffic light right away. The cops were showing up and everybody said, Panthers get things done. It was that kind of thing. We got a short time today. Why don't you describe how people become a member of the Australian Green Party? In the United States, you join a party by telling the state you're in the party, and then you get a primary ballot to vote on who should be the nominee. It's very different everywhere else in the world. So explain how you become a party member.
Yeah, sure. So if you want to become a member of the Greens in Australia, what you do is you actually join your local suburb, your local area group first and foremost. So for me, I live in the suburb of Newtown, and that means, to give you an American equivalent, one that I know, maybe in California, you join Sunset Greens, right? So you join your hyper-local area of the Greens. Now, for me, what that would look like is then you join that. Your local branch then is a member of the statewide body in New South Wales. And so you join from the grassroots up. Then the statewide body is a member of the National Party. But the Greens are the ones that control the membership. So basically, as a party member, you're signing up to join the Greens, and then as a result, you're a member of the New South Wales Greens, the state area, and then you're a member of the National Party, which is the Australian Greens. So for us, we're a federation of states. And one of the things that's critical in terms of our dynamic is, for me as a House of Representatives or lower house MP, what that looks like and in the Legislative Assembly in the state level is I am accountable back to the members that live in my local electorate. So if I do something that is outside of Greens policy or is against Greens principles, then those local members are the ones that I'm accountable back to. And so that maintains the ability for a grassroots structure, one of the key principles of the Greens as far as I'm concerned, to allow our membership to direct and to guide my work, but also to hold me to account if I was to go off and vote something against policy. And that is how our structure works. And to me, there are pains around a non-hierarchical, decentralized structure, but the benefits far outweigh the challenges of how slow sometimes things can be to work.
And when you apply for membership in your local, you have to agree to some principles. Is there a dues requirement?
Absolutely. You have to sign up to be supportive of the constitution of the Greens. You have to be committed to the principles of the party. And I am bound by policy. I don't get a conscience vote or an individual vote on anything in the New South Wales Greens. I have to vote in line with the policy, and all of the policies that have been developed are all actually devised by our membership through consultation with our membership, and they direct and guide the way that we vote and how we behave.
And what kind of dues are people expected to pay?
Oh, so on a practical level, so people that are paying membership are paying about $100. If you're a young Green, you pay just $5 Australian, so $2.50 or $50 US. But for me as a member of Parliament, I pay 12.5% of my MP's salary back to my local group, Green group, as a tithe, so that they can then do campaigning and other work in the area. So we tax our MPs back to build the party structure and fund our campaigning locally.
And if you're not a youth and not a member of, elected official, but you're just a regular working person, what would your dues be?
So I think they're about $100, so $50 US.
A year.
A year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that gives a sense, and we just beg for money. We do not have everybody obligated to pay. And people can join no matter what their politics. They just tell the state.
Right.
So talk about the Green Institute and how it's related to the party.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to observe, I think it's really important that to make an observation in terms of the membership, that yes, the members of the Greens at their local level devise the policy and get consulted and are devising the policy. They also pre-select our MPs. So that's the primaries that you guys have. The members are the ones who vote to pre-select who gets to run as an MP. The Green Institute in Australia is this interesting beast. We're a think tank, so we work on policy development, but also kind of political theory and practice, and we run workshops talking about how we do theory of change and things like that. We are the official think tank of the Australian Greens because we've been designated as such by the party. We're structurally a separate body. We're a separate NGO, basically. We're structured as a non-government organisation, which, whose job is to work on education and action and workshops and training around Greens politics. But the Greens, all political parties in Australia are actually publicly funded to a degree. We do get, obviously, donations and membership dues and all of that kind of thing. But you also win, for every vote cast at a federal election for your party, the government gives the party money, $4 for every single vote. So in the most recent federal election, we got 1.5 million votes around Australia, so we get $6 million or so as federal funding for the party, which is a huge benefit to enable us to organise, to put events on and all of that kind of thing, to pay staff, fundamentally, to pay a lot of staff to help us. The Green Institute isn't funded out of that, but the Parliament funds the Green Institute on the basis of how many MPs we have in the federal parliament. So there's a threshold. You don't get an institute if you've only got 1 or 2 MPs, but once you get to 5 MPs in the parliament, you're treated as an official parliamentary party, and that gives you benefits for your leader, gets certain benefits in the parliament, recognised in the parliament and things like that. And you also get a stream of funding for a think tank. It's not a huge amount. We get about $120,000 a year. To run a body which is about helping the Greens develop our policies better and develop our practices better, and to educate broadly on our politics. It's an incredible luxury, really. I'm very, very aware of the privilege of having an institute and being the guy who gets to run the institute. And I spend a lot of time going around the party talking to members, talking to MPs, but ordinary members. I've just run a series of workshops on theory of change for members around the country. How do we think we're trying to achieve the things that we're trying to achieve? How do we think power works in Australia? We're very aware we've got a much better electoral system than you guys have in America, or for instance exists in the UK. But our politics isn't necessarily a lot better for that, frankly. We still have a very kind of plutocratic politics. The corporations in Australia, the fossil fuel corporations, the gambling corporations, the property developers, give a lot of money to our major political parties and buy a lot of decisions in their favour, just like they do in the US. So we have really important conversations to have in the Greens in Australia about how we think we're going to achieve the things that we need to achieve.
Okay, we're getting musical accompaniment. I hope you guys can hear us well. So yeah, I think people need to think about the difference between Australia and other places in American parties. We have memberless parties. You can have any kind of politics and say, I want the green ballot. In fact, in some states, the Republicans will raid a Democratic primary or the other way around to get a weak candidate. The Democratic Party nationally was pushing at one point for Democrats where it looked like, Clinton was going to win the primary easily, to switch where they could in open primaries to vote for Trump, be an easier opponent to Clinton. Of course, didn't work out that way. So, so what else do we need to talk about here that people in the U.S. should know about?
I think maybe the council. Maybe one thing, Howie, I'd put in the mix is that we have had a long history in Australia in the Greens of having local council representation. So our most local level of government, we have 3 tiers of government. I'm in the state parliament, which is the middle one. We have our national parliament, but we also have local jurisdictions, and those local councils are quite often ward-based, so you're multi-member electorates, which means that it's much easier to get elected on a lower percentage of the vote. And in New South Wales, that has been the foundation of how we've shown and demonstrated to the community our Greens politics and our Greens values and what we do as representatives. That has boosted our ability to be able to run and do well at a state and a national level. So, for example, the area that I represent in a state jurisdiction, the Greens actually have won control of that local council area over about a decade ago, and had the mayor in that area and then had control and was governing locally. And so what you get out of that is a whole lot of people in the community that have seen the Greens politics and principles play out in practice in their local area. And so that helps bring across the people that aren't committed, lefties, the people that aren't sort of signed up to the big picture goals of the Greens, and see how does it work for me on local transport, bike path concerns. What does it mean when we want to see the changes to our local area and shifts to the way that we're doing recycling, shifts to the way that we're doing, active transport, shifts to the way that we're engaging with community services like libraries and, community support services. So to me, one of the other benefits we have is having strong representation at that really hyper-local level. In New South Wales, we have about 50 or 60 Greens councillors, and they are, if you like, the first level of breaking into a community to show that a Greens representative actually is working closely with the community and helps. And I think that's another challenge in areas where if there's not a direct connection with the membership, because the party can't own the membership, then you don't see that connection. Whereas our members know what it's like to have local council representatives. Then they work in our state elections and our national elections, having had success electing people locally. And I think that then boosts people's desire to want to volunteer because you're winning stuff, right? You're not just endlessly running and trying to achieve the change. You know and you remember what it feels like to win. And so you go harder at the next level and the next level of government to try and break through.
And I think, the lesson for us in the United States is that we have currently 138 local elected officials. Can't remember the total, but when we run locally, we win about a third of our races. This is in a single member district, winner-take-all system. Actually, in America, we get higher votes for Greens in these winner-take-all elections than some, European countries that have proportional representation, so they don't have the spoiler problem that we do. So there's a tremendous basis for green politics in the United States. I pointed out on things like Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, tuition-free public college, we have overwhelming majorities in the country that want that. The problem is public opinion doesn't translate into public policy in a two corporate party system where you got a center-right and a far-right party. and people are afraid to vote for the Progressive Party because they're really afraid of the far right, and that's the dynamic we get at the next level.
The other thing is money, right? Just
well,
donations. So we have limits. So the other real challenge that we've managed to combat is money in politics, right? And so the money, our elections are partly publicly funded, but in New South Wales we have really strict caps on who can donate and how much people can donate. So individuals can only donate up to 5,000 or 6,000 Australian dollars for a state election, and we cannot take donations from big tobacco, from property developers, and there are all of these, including gambling and clubs. So basically we rule out a whole lot of people infecting our democracy by putting really strict donation laws in place. And in our local seats, we have really strict caps on how much money you can spend. So you can't spend as much money as you want and have a candidate that has millions and millions step in at a state level. We have really strict laws and regulations around that too.
Well, in the last election, which was last year, right, for the federal, the Greens did better than ever before. The National Party, which is the Conservative Party, got beat by Labor, right?
Correct.
And you mentioned you have some ministries, it's coalition.
Oh, sorry, just in the ACT, not in the national.
Oh, in the ACT, okay.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you talk about, what your hopes and prospects are going forward? Because you have a two-party system, although you have more open electoral rules. So, what do you think, what do the politics of Australia look like?
I think what's really interesting in Australia is that we have historically had pretty much a two-party system. It's kind of a two-and-a-bit party system. The Australian Labor Party is one of them. The other is a coalition between what's called the Liberal Party, which is centre-right, and the National Party, which is quite more solidly right. But that two-party system is starting to collapse, actually, and it's been slowly eroding since the 1990s. Around the 1990s, the combined vote for those major parties was above 90%. It's been sliding down and down. At the last federal election last year, the combined vote for those two major parties was 67%. So 2/3 of people, 1/3 of people voted for Labor, 1/3 of people voted for the Liberal National Coalition, and 1/3 of people voted for somebody else. Half of them voted for us, for the Greens, and half of them voted for independents. And a lot of independents got elected at that election too. And it was kind of a fluke of the numbers that even with 1/3 of the vote, Labor managed to scrape themselves a majority in the House of Representatives. I think we're coming to the end of the two-party system in Australia, actually, and that's an amazing, amazing thing. With more and more independents and smaller parties and Greens are getting about half of the crossbench, mostly, elected. That's really changing the dynamic. New South Wales, Jenny can probably talk a bit more about, has also just had an election where the Labor won government but didn't win a majority. So we're getting to a point now where even with single member electorates, we're getting closer to a European kind of situation where the major parties aren't going to be able to win majorities. And that's going to change the way we do politics. It's not enough. I really, really want to emphasise this, that actually one of the things we've seen in Australia is Greens getting successful in numbers and in achieving access to government sometimes actually ends up dragging us to the Conservative centre because we have to work with the major parties that don't share our values. And it actually isn't necessarily always as good as, it's very difficult. It's really, really hard to be in those positions, and you see Greens ending up having to support things that they don't want to support in those kinds of relationships. But don't get me wrong, the end of the two-party system in Australia is coming, and that's a fantastic thing. Maybe, Jenny, you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, just to say, I think that's the thing, right? The closer you get to power, the more risk you have of being corrupted by that power. And, just like the Greens are not free of colonial thoughts or, we don't exist in a bubble that's free of patriarchy and sexism and racism. We also don't exist in a vacuum free of the idea of the potential for power to influence and access to power to influence the challenges around our commitment to grassroots politics. For me, there are a couple of things that have to sit to protect from that. The first is an absolutely strong connection back to the grassroots and the membership. in terms of making sure that they are in control of guiding the decisions that are made. The second is the idea of making sure we have limited terms so that people cannot keep running again and again and again and get caught up as career politicians and do nothing else. And I think the third element to that is making sure that in terms of how our party works, that the party structures are held strong and that it's not dominated by members of parliament being able to make the decisions about all of the things. And I think those are critical challenges for us in the Australian Greens as we get more successful, as we have closer to the power, as we've seen in potentially other countries around the world where the Greens have been able to form governments or form coalitions, is that actually what we want is to make sure we're not just taking power for power's sake, but we're doing it because we're getting outcomes. And so I would say the best way as the antidote to do that is to commit to the idea that the way we make change is not by just increasing our numbers in parliament, but connecting ourselves to social and environmental movements outside of the party that will make sure that they hold us to account. Because if we're getting mass movements protesting against things the Greens are doing, we know we're headed down the wrong path, because we should be the voice of those social movements inside our democracy, not the other way around. And if we are always connected and listening to those movements, they will keep us radical, they will keep us pushing in the right direction. And when it feels uncomfortable for me in the parliament to stand up and say the things I say, because I know that not a single person in that chamber will support us except for my two Greens colleagues, I know that there are thousands on the street that back that position, and that I'm not there to impress the others in the chamber. I'm there to speak up for the thousands outside, and that connection to social movements will keep us a radical party. But it is a challenge to do that when you get closer and closer to the trappings of power.
And that's sort of been a historical trend where social change parties on the progressive side, when the movements are strong, they're more militant. And when the movements recede, then the ones we elect are thinking about their political careers. They start making compromises. So that's why we need the movement and the party. I know you've got a commitment, Jenny, to get to, and you're pretty soon too, I believe. Yeah. So, well, we've been going 37 minutes, and there's a lot of stuff that we've talked about. So I don't feel a need to extend it, particularly because we don't have live questions. Because I think there's a lot that people should maybe listen and take notes. But any last word, Jenny?
I guess just to say that I'm really, really keen to encourage people to realize that there are systems that we can break through and change, and actually the momentum of how we make that change is everyone taking the jump at the same time. And so I would encourage people to think about how we can build and connect with social movements, but also how we ensure that we are encouraging people that are disenfranchised and disconnected from the political system to actually get engaged and active in politics. Because the best way that we are going to change this is the people that feel like the system is not for them to engage and connect with our social movements. And we need to listen to where people's frustrations are and not just speak to the people that are converted to the idea of talking politics hour on end, but actually chat to people where they are and reflect back to them and connect with them to try and push for the changes that they want to see. And that's what I'm trying to do and am committed to do. And it's great to be here at the Global Greens Conference in Korea to do that and to chat to you, Howie.
Well, thank you for being with us. And Jenny didn't say it, but one thing I'm getting from delegates to this Congress all over the world is, we got to do change in the United States, because it's a big, powerful country, very militarized, intervening around the world, huge economic impact, neoliberal policies through multilateral economic institutions, the immigration question, you go on and on. And so I hope Jenny just inspired people to keep going, because what they've done should encourage us. So, Jenny, thanks for being here, and maybe we'll do it with better technology. We had a little problem getting started today. That's why we're doing it on the phone. Get you in the future. So, thank you. And Tim, anything more you would like to touch on?
Yeah, look, thanks so much, Howie, for having me on. And I think it's really, really important for us to acknowledge there's a lot of conversation obviously here, but also all around the place around how the problems that you guys have with your democratic system in the US affect so many others, and the impact of US politics on Australian politics is very, very real. And we see some of the worst kind of aspects of what the Republicans try to do infecting our right-wing parties, and we also see the craven conservatism of the Democratic Party really affecting the Labor Party in Australia in particularly powerful ways. The latest thing that we've got going on, of course, that I think is one of the kind of the undercurrents here in South Korea is the AUKUS treaty. I don't know how much discussion there is of that in the US because it's probably smaller fry compared to how big a deal it is in Australia. But the Australia, UK, US treaty, which is supposedly providing Australia with nuclear submarines. Australia, as until now, a non-nuclear country and a very anti-nuclear country, is having a really detrimental impact on Australian politics in all sorts of ways. It's kind of brought out the worst kind of militarism and pro-US military-industrial complex attitude in our governing Labor Party. It's also stupendously expensive for Australia. Australia does not have a huge military budget, but we've now dedicated 368 billion Australian dollars to these nuclear submarines. So that militarism is really, really problematic for Australia. And I guess, that reflects kind of one of the things that I really want to emphasise, as I kind of said a little bit earlier. My book, Living Democracy, is kind of about the fact that we've been talking on this podcast a lot about how the Australian political system, electoral system, enables us to, in the Australian Greens, to have a bigger impact on politics than the US Greens might be able to have in your electoral politics. And that's been a positive thing, but it also sometimes makes us complacent. And one of the things I really want to talk about a lot in Australia is that our very good electoral system actually makes us think that we've got a really healthy democracy, and we really actually don't. Our democracy is really unhealthy. It's still based on colonialism. It's still based on patriarchy. It's still based on coercive power. Fundamentally, it's really based on this top-down, hierarchical, coercive system of power. And I think as Green Socialists, you would generally, presumably, be the same kind of attitude to me, and I know Howie, in terms of believing in grassroots up systems of, Murray Bookchin style, municipal confederalism and grassroots up power. And we all over the world need to be thinking not just how can we improve our systems a little bit, how can we make a little bit of positive change within these systems, but how can we transform those systems? And that's the big conversation I've been trying to have here in South Korea with other Greens around the world, to say, let's not just kind of try to make things a little bit greener within the current system. Let's actually be talking about how we can truly transform these systems, transform systems of power to be grassroots up and truly reflective of ecological wisdom, truly based in non-violence, non-coercion. These kinds of things are a crucial thing for us as a party to be constantly holding dear and working on. So thanks for the opportunity to chat.
Well, thanks, Tim, for being here. And I think let's call it a day for this, because there's so much content. I hope people think about what they've done in Australia, the kind of grassroots organizing, how they've taken advantage of a ranked choice voting system, including proportional ranked choice voting. And the fact that you guys have been around since, you had the earliest,
1980s.
well, didn't you have a party in Tasmania? It's a
1979, the United Tasmania Group.
Okay.
And the Greens were founded.
Yeah, so they've been doing this from the beginning. It's been, 40 plus years, and they're having their best year ever now. So it takes a while for these things to take hold. And, you look around the world with the climate emergency, new nuclear arms race, growing inequality, and the Greens are doing better than ever in Europe, here in Australia. They're growing, Africa and Asia, meeting people from all over the world. Papua New Guinea, and they're campaigning for West Papua, a colony of Indonesia that most of us don't know anything about, as if the only imperialism is American. We need to, and we have a responsibility, as I was saying earlier, to the world, to change the United States. So I know people have been, in the Trump era, been getting discouraged. And, they got rid of Trump and they got Biden, and he's drilled more oil and gas drilling than Trump did in the same period. He's treating the migrants as bad. And I could go on. We just had this debt ceiling where the Republicans blackmailed the Democrats into austerity. And that's why we need the Green Party. So I'm just urging you to stay optimistic, stay active. And I met a lot of people here. We're going to have some on future podcasts. One is a very courageous man named Frank Habineza, who is the member of the parliament in Rwanda, and he's running for president next year. He's run before. He's putting his life on the line. I mean, there's some, violent repression he's faced, and he's going to come on a podcast. And I'll probably grab a couple other people. So, stay tuned for that. So now I got to figure out how to email this file so it appears in time when you guys tuned in, because we did this at we did it on Saturday morning or midday, and it's about midnight Friday where you are. So figure that out. All I know is that file should be ready by the time you normally tune in, 3 o'clock Eastern time in the U.S. So everybody have a good week. Pray for Trump's indictment on the attempted coup and overthrow the election, and we'll see you next week.